Okay, so this is an audio review for Chapter 8, Diversity in Families, the Social Construction of Intimacy. Okay, so intimacy, as much as it seems very personal to us, it also takes shape in, by a societal context with societal values. Some major social changes have influenced intimate relationships, and we'll talk about this kind of throughout the lecture, how people make decisions about their intimate relationships within a social context. So depending on your position in society or your social location in different institutions, this will determine the way that you find love and really what you find attractive or sexy. So the messages we get from larger society are mixed, right? We live in a very sexually prudish culture that stresses a narrow sexual standard for women to be pure and chaste virgins, while we use sexuality as a means to sell just about everything in society, which can be a super confusing message, especially for young girls who get this mixed message, very early on. So this kind of what's often called the Madonna whore dichotomy, right? The lady in the streets, freak in the sheets kind of idea. So over the past several decades, a new emphasis on relationships and sexuality has emerged to create what's called the intimacy revolution. So the purpose of marriage has shifted from economic necessity to companionship, and more recently to personal growth and fulfillment through deeper intimacy. So not only are macro level forces implicated in the contemporary need for intimacy, but they also shape our mate selection decisions. So again, we'll talk about that more in a moment, but just setting that up. So some connect the rise of interracial or same-sex relationships in recent decades to more social independence for young people. It's now expected for young adults to move out of their parents' home and live on their own before getting married, and it's during this time that most will make their mate selections. People that are farther from their family's influence will care less if their parents approve of their relationship, right? It just makes sense. Versus if you think back to what we were talking about in the more colonial America, Victorian America, all those times where, the family was a huge impact, had a huge impact on your mate selection, your, obviously limiting your intimacy, things like that. So this is, kind of a new feature of, this post-industrial time period where people have, much more time to devote to these kind of quests. So we've separated our private selves from the public self that we display for others. And this separation has created the need for intimacy. So this kind of relates to that, Goffman's understanding of front stage and backstage, right? That you have your front stage, your performance that you provide for the world, but then you have the backstage, which is all the kind of preparation that goes into that particular performance. So in the context of a private or public self, we have who we really are, but then we have the perception of ourselves that we try to create for the world to see. So a good example of that would be, we'll talk about this later, would be like dating apps or like online dating, where people can basically create a somewhat false profile to kind of sell to themselves or diminish others. So you're basically giving your public self is all the good stuff, all the good pictures from the right angle. And then the private self is all the kind of, things that actually go into those performances. So whether it's, maybe you have self-esteem issues, so you'll only post certain photos or, whatever it might be. And so it's important to see that, we want to show ourselves through impression management, through what Goffman calls impression management. We want to have people see the best side of ourselves. So we really kind of try to manipulate the way that others see us so that we have a favorable image in their mind, right? Just kind of like Instagram. Like that's the best example of impression management ever. That you can literally filter your photo before you post it, right? To make sure that it looks a certain way to, propel a certain public image of yourself. Even if that, was maybe the 50th picture you took so that you would have that angle, right? So why this is also important too is that when it comes to intimacy, intimate relationships really allow us to be ourselves without being judged. So it's important for people to find someone they can really be themselves with, someone who isn't going to judge them. And Goffman saw the evolution of relationships from casual dating and to marriage as going gradually from your front stage performance where you're trying to, look really cool for someone, not fart, right? Things like that, to the backstage with a person, like when they use the bathroom after you, right? And you really tore her up. right? So this is why a lot of times people do not introduce someone that they're casually hooking up with to their parents, because again, they're trying to perform this kind of front stage version of themselves. But when you're really, go from that kind of barely dating to seriously dating to marriage stage, you're obviously going to kind of allow them much more into the backstage, into the real of who you are, right? So in this strive for intimacy, we expect our intimate partner to be all things for us. So we have this cultural idea that this other person will complete us, right? You're my soulmate, right? And we expect them to complement us in every way. But in reality, each person is not a half of a person, right? We're a full people. And the expectation for one person to be our everything is an extreme recipe for disappointment. It's a major source of marital strain and contributes to the large amounts of divorces that we see, right? Because, yeah, maybe this person is your lover, your best friend, your whatever, but at the same time, they can't be everything at all times, right? You also still need family and friends and other connections and networks and relationships. Because if you put it all on that one person, that's just really unfair. Because that's just, a societal thing we've created. That's not something someone can actually live up to. Alrighty, so heterosexual mate selection. So while mate selection used to involve family and community, it is today a more independent orientation. So historically, relationships or marriages were arranged by parents to combine territories, to make financial arrangements, to join families together. But now people find someone independent of their families and eventually bring them around the family once they're established in the relationship. So in the 1900s, it was customary to come calling, right? That idea of structured meeting between a young woman and a young man under the watchful eyes of their family members. But by the 1920s, couples started to go out on dates, far from their parents' supervision. The initiation of dates shifted from a girl allowing a boy to, quote, come calling to her house, to a boy asking a girl out on a date. So girls did not ask boys because at the time, girls were still considered second-class citizens. This is why, men pay, because going out involves money and women had less of it. So they can't ask someone to pay for them versus asking someone over to your house. So that's kind of how those things evolved. And now we have this kind of expectation that still kind of lingers in our society. So by the middle of the 20th century, going steady was very common in high school and college. So as a result of this, parents have less control over young adults' decisions about mate selection. Historically, parents had all the say, and as times changed, the custom still involved getting a father's blessing before proposing marriage. But this is no longer the accepted custom, although some still adhere to it. So things have changed in the past few decades that allow young people more choices. So one is the importance of education, right? Also the decline of rural America and the lure of cities, changing work patterns in the economy, and more freedom for women. So during this historical move from rural to city came with it a changing ideology of marriage for romantic love. So when it comes to teen dating, fewer teens date now than in the past. The number of teens that never go on a date has risen considerably since 1900, as the dating patterns have changed, versus the percentage of teens who date frequently, or defined as more than one a week, has also fallen since 1900. So teen dating is associated with both positive and negative consequences. For some, teen dating brings confidence, autonomy, better knowledge about oneself, what you like and what you dislike about a mate. It's a process of trial and error, right? So if you go through those dates, you're like, well, I like this part, but I don't like that part, right? So it helps you understand who you want to be with. For other teens, frequent dating is associated with conflict with parents, more depression, lower academic motivation, and achievement than other teens. So it depends on the characteristics and the quality of the dating relationship, especially because, one of the things that's rarely discussed when talking about teens and dating is the prevalence of dating violence, right? Which is the highest in teen communities. We tend to think of violence in a, IPV or interpersonal violence context within married relationships, but there's actually more violence within teen dating relationships. So adolescents typically engage in what's called group dating, right, in the 21st century. So that means adolescents or groups of people go out to the movies or to school dances or to if you got maybe back in the day when a Disneyland pass wasn't so expensive, to Disneyland, or again, local fairs, festivals, things like that, where they go as a group. So instead of having to ask someone out on a date and deal with the anxiety of that, you kind of have a group of guys, a group of girls go together. And so people are able to kind of foster those relationships in a group context. So online dating is also a significant development in contemporary mate selection. Not long ago, these platforms didn't exist, right? So people were limited to dating only those people in their extended social networks, right? Meaning getting set up for a blind date because, so-and-so knows someone and they'd be great for you, right? And so now with these dating apps, we even have new terminology that's entered the dating world, like, oh, swipe right on that, right? Or things like that. Also, when it comes to these factors like gender, race, and class, these really affect our mate selection as well. So when you think about gender, when people go out on a date, who asks who out? Who pays? Who initiates sex? So traditional gender role expectations still structure dating interactions, and they've remained that way in our expectations of who pays, who asks who's out, and who initiates sex. There are expectations that men will pick where the date is and pick a woman up, be prepared to pay for her meals, while women are expected to take a while to get ready, wait to be picked up, and be the recipient of any physical or sexual advances, but not the initiator. Right? So again, and this reflects in the language. Like, what do we call a guy who has a lot of sex versus what do we call a woman who has a lot of sex? It reflects that sexual double standard that has relaxed a little bit over time. This assumption that men who have sex are praised while women who have sex are vilified, it still remains deeply embedded in our culture. So social class, again, another important factor. Actually, I was skipping over race. Sorry, let me go back to race really quick. Interracial relationships are likely to form in integrated settings. So meaning when you're interacting with more people that are of different, race or ethnicity, that obviously opens up more relationships. But we live in very racially segregated neighborhoods and as a result, schools. So we often don't come in contact with people that have different race or ethnic groupings. So it makes sense that a lot of people still date and marry within group. But if you're in a more integrated setting like the military, right, where you get people from all over, colleges, universities, right, and metropolitan areas, you're going to run into a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds. So in these areas that, have more access, there's a lot more interracial dating. But in areas that are more segregated, people are less likely to interact with anyone from a different race or ethnicity, so obviously less likely to marry them. So interracial dating is much more common and accepted in the US today, but it was really only a couple decades ago when miscegenation laws went away and people were even allowed to marry outside of their race. All right, going back to class, which I tried to jump into. All right, so class, obviously dating and courtship patterns vary by social class. Upper class youth are brought up in exclusive communities with exclusive schools, country clubs, right, things like that, that control who they're exposed to. So living a highly segregated life, obviously parents have a lot of control in arranging their children's marriages. If not directly, then by making sure they're only associating with, quote, good families, meaning they're going to marry someone of similar social class and maintain that financial privilege and segregation. While middle-class youth have more freedom to choose than upper-class youth, their parents are still more involved than lower-class youth. So middle-class youth are more likely to attend school, church, community-sponsored events that, their parents will kind of allow them to go to. That also is where they get a lot of dating, which is, much more so than lower-class youth. Lower-class youth are less likely to date in structured activities, but are more likely to just gather in the street or, bowling alleys, bars, kind of just in group settings to meet other people. So when it comes to stratification in dating, it's this principle of least interest, right? This whoever cares the least gets to somehow have more power in the relationship. So it's interesting how these kind of power dimensions of gender, race, class really do mitigate who has most power in the relationship. So when it comes to immigration status, first-generation immigrants are more traditional in their relationship behaviors, while second-generation immigrants are more likely to have adopted the norms of American youth culture. Okay, so I included these videos that I would have shown you in class, but I can't include them in the audio because of copyright issues on YouTube. So what I'd ask is that you just take a moment to watch these two videos. They're pretty short, but they do have some interesting information about heterosexual mate selection, especially this science of sex appeal here at the bottom, which is interesting, where It shows how people tend to match themselves with other people that are considered in a kind of beauty hierarchy, right? How we'll say like, oh, that person's a 10, or oh, I'd say he's a 6, or something like that. And how people actually, match up and deal with this kind of ranking and hierarchy of sexual appeal. So just go ahead and watch those real quick, and then we'll move on to the next part. Okay, so when it comes to intimate partnering, there are some factors within mate selection that are, again, structural, coming from society. So one of these is legal, right? So until 1967, 17 states have miscegenation laws, making it illegal to marry someone of a different race. Same-sex marriage was illegal and was just, within a few years ago, recently made legal across 50 states. So there are legal regulations that prohibit marriage between close relatives, but states vary on what's considered close. So these are some terrible fun facts. So for example, in California, it's legal to marry your first cousin, which, side note, Rudy Giuliani married his first cousin. But California, go for that, I guess. If you really like your cousin, if they're a super fox, then boom, legal. In some states, it's only okay to marry your first cousin if you're infertile or over 50 or 65, depending on the state. In others, it's illegal to marry your first cousin at all. So again, the law shapes our available pool of cousins. I mean, just kidding. I mean mates, right? So obviously, the law is going to shape, if it says it's illegal to marry someone of the same sex or a different race or things like that, then the law really affects who can marry whom. I guess the last dimension of that is cousins. All right, so some of the terminology from the chapter: homogamy, hypogamy, and hypergamy. So homogamy is just, again, that means that people tend to marry others who are very similar to them, right? Meaning you have the same religion, you have the same race, ethnicity, the same social class, stuff like that, right? And so oftentimes, even though it's like every movie, 1980s movie, Wrong Side of the Tracks, this hypogamy, hypergamy thing, it's pretty uncommon, right? Most people end up with someone that's pretty close to them in all social factors, right? Hypogamy is when you move up a social class through marriage, right? You're the broke one on the wrong side of the tracks. And hypergamy is when you marry down in social class, right? And we can even see the hierarchy there, up or down. So it's interesting when you look at important qualities, meaning the qualities that men and women think are important in selecting a mate. And this was, based on the research that they talk about in the chapter. It was mutual attraction, love, right? Dependable character, emotional stability, and maturity. And again, the textbook argues that perhaps now partners are looking for also a partner who's successful in the labor market, since, that's much more of an economic concern than it was in the past. Some structural influences on mate selection includes the availability of marriageable partners, right? Obviously, it's like there are some countries that just because the proportions of male to female, there's very few women. So obviously that affects, men's access to those kind of dating populations. There's also a variety of group affiliations that we have, meaning the more varied affiliations that you have with different groups that you're provided, that's going to provide you more opportunities to meet and stay in contact with dissimilar others. So people may marry outside their social group because of their multiple and interwoven group affiliations. Right? Schools also can play a major role in finding a potential mate. High school and then college further narrows choices of mates. So since college attendance is strongly associated with your parents' socioeconomic status, it's likely that college students will choose someone similar to marry because that's just who's around, right? You kind of marry the people you actually have met, right? So despite our belief that we marry, someone that because they're our soulmate, right? It's a personal choice to us. These structural influences are a strong factor in our mate selection. Okay, so the sociology of sexuality is an emerging area of research that examines how society shapes the expression of sexual desire through cultural images and social institutions. So the social constructionist approach examines the underlying social motivations and mechanisms that shape human social relationships and society. So the tenets of social construction theory are that human sexuality varies across time and of course over the life course of any individual. And that although sexuality is the site of our most intimate experiences, it is socially controlled, right? It's obviously connected and bound up with the basic inequalities that configure our society, mostly class, race, and gender, specifically, at least for this lecture. So, your biology alone does not determine human sexuality. We socially determine what's considered sexy. So activities condemned in one society may be encouraged in another. So again, sexuality is not all about biology. It has a lot to do with the influence of culture. Also, social institutions channel and direct sexual behavior according to what's defined as socially acceptable or normal. So this is also changing in a culture that has now normalized, pornography. So it's interesting. I included this video here, which again, I can't play it in this audio or they will copyright infringe me, but I do ask that, before you move on to the next part of this audio, that you just stop and watch this really quick, just a couple minutes. And he makes an interesting argument. He basically says that, because of the way that the sexuality being actually shown in the pornography limits his actual expression of sexuality, meaning he is saying that he basically refers to pornography as sex with no hands, meaning that there's not a lot of intimacy being shown. There's not a lot of kissing or foreplay or things like that that are actually connecting people together. What you really just see is kind of more, kind of graphic sexual relationship. And so as a result, it affects the way that you then actually desire sex. So he was talking about how just watching a TV show about, a version of The Voice that you start thinking about, well, what song would I sing? What thing would I do? And he just basically uses that as a metaphor to say, watching these things, consuming these things affects the way that we then internally desire and see ourselves, right? So he said, when he goes around and talks to a lot of people and asks them about their first desires, it wasn't just, penetrative sex. Oftentimes people desire kissing a person, touching a person, hugging a person, things that are also intimate and not just about, the sexual act. So basically he kind of makes this interesting argument about how the power of these kind of cultural models of pornography can really affect the way that we then see and understand our own sexuality, right? So I just watch that video really quick from the actual PowerPoint, or from the Canva, link, the PDF, whatever, you can click on it, so that, you can watch that video. Okay, so when enlarging the sexuality frame from just heterosexuality, obviously heterosexuality and homosexuality are social constructs, both at the macro level, where society determines what same-sex relationships mean, and at the micro level, where individuals obtain their sexual identities, and everywhere in between. So the terms sexual identity and sexual orientation basically just refer to how people classify themselves, right? Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to, right? And sexual identity is kind of your own internalized sense of your sexuality. So sexual identity and sexual behavior may differ because gender identity and sexual identity get mixed up, but there is a distinct definition. So for example, in some cultures, men are still considered heterosexual if they've had sex with men, as long as they were the penetrator. For transgender people in our culture, living in the gender role of the opposite sex, they may identify as heterosexual but have same-sex relationships. So there's debate about whether homosexuality has genetic or social origins. Is it inborn? Is it shaped by experiences? Despite whether there's biological evidence, for sexual orientation, it's always a social identity as well. Right? So it's important to kind of understand it from both of those angles, from how, it is a way that it's defined culturally, even if it's something that you either determine for your own identity or not. So sexual orientations are not only a matter of genital activity, but also social creations with norms. And those kind of say that we have different values or behaviors or expectations about our sexuality based on those identifiers. So when it comes to the sexual revolution, right, the meaning and place of sexuality in America has undergone great changes. So it's moved from a family-centered reproductive system in colonial days to a focus on romantic sexuality in the 19th century. But again, by the 20s, sexuality became a major source of identity and self-discovery. For the next decades after the sexual revolution, 1960s, redefined sex as a right, for individuals, not just something for procreation. Larger economic and social changes in society are also linked to this change, such as the rising age of marriage, educational convergence of men and women, women's growing rights and autonomy, the invention of birth control methods, meaning the pill, IUDs, things like that, the rise in the number of single people, right? And the social movements that coalesced around that time period of the baby boomers, right? Actively rejecting sexuality and the rules of previous generations. So in modern times, sexuality is highly commercialized and is supposed to provide individual identity and happiness apart from reproduction. So advertising and entertainment media have been important forces contributing to sexual permissiveness. And sex sells almost everything today. So the media has this fixation on sex. And it is served to involve children and youth earlier and earlier into thinking about sex and sexual activity. So the girls in this ad to the left here, to the right, are, let's see, 16, 14, and 12, right there, but are hypersexualized like Victoria's Secret models for a California clothing retailer. Again, this normalizes that teen girls are primarily important for how they look. And this motivates girls to internalize sexualization and learn to sexualize themselves. So again, I can't click on the video for right now to show you right now, but I really do hope you watch this video where Jean Kilbourne, who is a scholar who looks specifically at advertising and how it affects the way that women are viewed in society and also end up internalizing and viewing themselves. So she talks about how advertising constructs this image of women as things, as sexual objects, and also how there has real-life consequences for men and women in the way that women are then treated and perceived in the culture. So again, just take the moment out, click on the actual link on there, and then, then continue listening to me jaw flap. Okay, so when it comes to scientific research on sexuality, so there's obviously, again, we talked about the social context of these things, right? Meaning that, national surveys have really found that there's been substantial changes in women's sexual behavior over the past decades, but smaller, but yet still significant changes in men's behavior. The most valuable part of the new surveys on sexuality is that they look at sexuality in that social context, right? Meaning that people's sexual choices are shaped by the social networks in which they operate. So one of these studies they talked about in the chapter is the National Health and Social Life Survey, which found that adultery is the exception more than the rule, right? Meaning that 75% of men and 85% of women never cheat on their spouse. Also that people in the U.S. are divided into 3 groups according to how often they have sex, a third of which have sex twice a week or more, a third have sex a few times a month, and a third only a few times a year. When it comes to incidences of homosexuality, this is actually quite low. About 2.8% of men and 1.4% of women report a homosexual identity. And when it comes to what kinds of couples have sex the most, it's married couples. Unlike what, culture has told us, married couples are more likely to have sex, especially than single people, and they're more likely to experience orgasms as well. So it's really interesting about that too, because it kind of makes sense that if you're just like hooking up with people in a culture and you're not worried about seeing them again, you're not worried about their pleasure. But if you're married to this person, you got to deal with this person all the damn time, you're probably more worried about making sure that they have pleasure from that interaction. So of course, questions still remain about whether people tell the truth about their sexual behaviors. You have the Global Study for Sexual Attitudes and Behaviors. This is the newest research on sexuality. It was in the text. So they surveyed over 27,000 people of middle and older adults in 29 countries and really looked at specifically the physical and emotional qualities of their sex lives. They found that the highest levels of sexual well-being are found in Western countries where gender equality is the highest. No shock there. So again, scientific research on sexuality is fundamental because it tells us the reality from the fiction that we kind of tell ourselves. So that's why I put a picture of Kinsey here, who was very famous for his research in the 1950s on sexuality that really expanded our understanding of sexual categories. All right, so moving on, AIDS is another issue related to, intimacy. So between 1981 and 2010, more than 1.1 million Americans were diagnosed with AIDS. So basically, AIDS itself and its spread has been responsible for changes in sexual attitudes in the U.S. So the knowledge of how people were infected with HIV virus motivated many people to stay away from unprotected sex. So it was originally thought of in the 1980s as a homosexual disease because, there was a lot of HIV transmission from male to male sexual contact. So there was this kind of assumption, and this is really why I included a video here about George H.W. Bush and his legacy of ignoring the AIDS crisis when it was really taking over and taking hold in the country, largely because it was considered IV drug users and homosexuals that were getting AIDS. So those were considered very low status people in society in the early 1990s, and therefore, who cares if they died? So this is why, these things weren't taken as seriously as they needed to be. And again, I ask that you watch this video. It's only a couple minutes just to kind of get the context of what was going on at the time. So 3/4 of women who are diagnosed with AIDS were infected through heterosexual contact. And HIV has increasingly become a disease of color, with African American men being diagnosed at a rate 7 times that of white men, and African American women being diagnosed at a rate 20 times that of white women. So African Americans make up roughly 13% of the population, but account for 46% of all new AIDS cases. So, I did put also a video here that kind of connects some of the structural factors to the issues of AIDS, meaning, sub-Saharan Africa is the place where there's so many new cases of HIV transmission. And largely, this has to do with the lack of women's rights, meaning they don't have control over their bodies or over reproduction. So if you don't have access to condoms or things to protect yourself, it obviously is going to affect whether or not you actually end up with the disease. So I put that video in here as well as a way to kind of understand how the structural factors lead to issues of diseases like this. Okay, when it comes to teen sexuality and childbearing, adolescents today have more sexual freedom than preceding generations, but they've also become sexually active earlier than their parents did. We also live in a highly sexualized culture that pressures teens to be sexually active. I mean, if you've ever watched any CW drama, everyone that's like 25 that's pretending to be 15 is all having sex, right? So approximately 54% of teenagers have had sexual intercourse by the time they finish school. The average age tends to be around 17. And this is the average, but there are some variations by race, class, and gender in regard to who has sex in their teen years. And this early sexuality puts teens at risk for teen pregnancy, STDs or STIs. And having intercourse at young ages is also associated with having more partners, less protection, and more likelihood of non-consensual or unwanted sex. So the U.S. has the highest rates of teenage pregnancy when you talk about the developed world. And so this has a lot to do with the absence of comprehensive sex education in our schools, right? Sex education in schools is a controversial topic when it shouldn't be. As a long-term strategy, abstinence education was used for many years, especially during the Bush administration, which again seems very unrealistic in the current social context, as premarital sex is the norm rather than the exception among all groups. So the federal emphasis had centered on innovative approaches and evidence-based programs for preventing unintended pregnancies, HIVs, and STDs. But over the past several decades, we've seen teen pregnancy as more and more of a social factor. So, as a social problem, basically, that if we see, especially low-income communities or, racial minority communities where there's more teen pregnancy, we often use a lot of judgment without actually understanding why, right? Like something that we discuss in my criminology class when talking about the book Code of the Street is how he talks about how there's these young women in the neighborhood that are having children, largely because most women in a context where they have rights and control over their bodies choose to have kids at a later age so that they can get like an education and a better job and more stability in life. But think about it. What if you think that you're never going to go to college, you're never going to have a life, you're not going to live past 25? Then there's nothing to stop you, right, from having, sex and unprotected sex and actually having children as a teenager, right? So this is a problem with sex education in schools. If you had the kind of sex ed I did, then it was just a couple hours of a health class once, and they basically just showed you like a diagram of a penis, a diagram of a vagina, and then you're supposed to label it. But that doesn't tell you anything about consent, barely learn about safe sex, barely learn about, kind of autonomy and freedom and the idea of, sex being a consensual, agreed upon thing, right? So again, early motherhood also makes young women vulnerable, but not poor. Meaning, teenage pregnancy does correlate with poverty, but the correlation means that most teen mothers were poor before they got pregnant, not as a result of their pregnancy. So being a young mother poses challenges as women try to navigate school and work with a child, right? So there's figure 8.2 from your book that shows racial differences in teen birth rates. And, the U.S. teen birth rate for 2010 declined to 34.4 live births per 1,000 teens, which was, a historic low at that point. But again, this is a problem where we have a much higher teen pregnancy rate than other developed nations. And again, part of that has to do with not having access to healthcare, all the restrictions that are placed on contraceptives and birth control and abortion. And also kind of touching back on this idea of early motherhood. Like we saw in Teen Mom 2, 16 Pregnant, if you're dumb like me and watched all that crap, which I did, then you saw that a lot of those girls were like really wealthy. Like they had homes by the time they were like 19, probably because they're on the damn show. Like I guess I messed up in life. I should have just had a kid and got on TV. But basically, they do kind of portray this interesting lifestyle where you can see, even for these wealthy, privileged girls, it's difficult for them to go back to school. It's difficult for them to get a full-time job. Like, it's difficult to do those things because it's already hard enough just getting out of high school, going to college, doing those things. But also having a young one to take care of is an additional burden. So a lot of these young women, if they were already poor when they had a kid, remain in poverty, right? But it doesn't make you poor. It just makes it harder to get out of poverty, right? When it comes to differentiated forms of intimacy, so the more significant dimension of sexuality that we have is gender, meaning gender relates to the social context of sexual behavior and desire. So in this kind of, heteronormative model in society, right, women and men want and expect different things from intimate heterosexual relationships. So expectations and style of love also vary by gender. So the model for male sexuality stresses performance, while female model stresses emotional relationships, meaning men tend to be more casual about sex. They can easily compartmentalize their feelings about love and sex, while women often view sex as a bonding experience. So some researchers feel that sex is the main domain in which male dominance is reinforced and female subservience is reinforced, right? That kind of mainstream acceptance of pornography and porn culture has led to our scripts about sex as an act, and that act is about male desire. It's not about, kind of a couple, kind of strengthening an intimate relationship together. So again, it just shows how those media effects influence the way that we then internalize our own understandings of sexuality. So when it comes to same-sex orientation and intimacy, variance from the societal norm of heterosexuality was legally prohibited until 2003. So sodomy laws, meaning that kind of history of selective enforcement of deviance, is part of this, meaning, so when we think about the word sodomy, we tend to think about a specific sexual act, right? Anal sex. But that's not actually what sodomy means. Sodomy means any non-procreative sexual act, right? And so as a result, when sodomy laws were first put in place, it meant that if you were married, if you were single, if you were gay or straight, no matter what, you were not allowed to engage in sodomy, meaning non-procreative sex. So since same-sex relationships are, by definition, non-procreative sex, this became deviant, and basically, when you make a core part of someone's identity deviant, you make the person deviant, if that makes sense. So it wasn't just same-sex sex that was deviant, it became the people themselves that were deviant. And so the sodomy laws that existed on the books were selectively targeted towards homosexual communities. That's why people started identifying the term sodomy with, anal sex, when that's not actually what it means. Right? So it shows how the structural factors, the cultural factors, same-sex marriage is now legal, right? There are these kind of things, but again, that's obviously constructed our understandings of these things in the past. So broad social support networks are missing for gay and lesbian couples, and gender still plays an important role in intimate relationships, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual. So lesbians are still more likely to establish long, committed relationships, as heterosexual women strive to do, while homosexual men are more likely to develop relationships on the basis of having sex like heterosexual men do. So the gendered understandings of relationships affect heterosexuals and homosexual relationships because they structure our expectations and our goals. So the conditions under which sexuality and love are experienced also vary by social class. However, differences are becoming less clear. So some of the research in the book discovered that, the lower class have inclined towards a no-nonsense, silent approach to sex versus a self-conscious, elaborate approach of higher classes, especially in regard to how people have sex, oral sex, and foreplay. So for the wealthy, this is more drawn out compared to the poor that kind of get her done without all the thrills, or the frills, sorry. So the experience of sexuality and love also varies by social class, right? Just because our lives vary by social class. So while most people uphold the ideology of love, there are class differences in resources to sustain that ideal. Intimacy in marital relationships is also affected by economic conditions. So it's not as if poorer women care less about the emotional aspects of their relationship than rich women do, but poorer women are more focused on the necessities of life than the emotions first. Also, there's differences of color, culture, and ancestry that create clear sexual boundaries. So race and intimacy is another issue, right? Throughout U.S. history, powerful sexual stereotypes have been central in creating and sustaining racial hierarchies. So like, for example, the myth of the black male rapist, things like that have really come to kind of serve white supremacist ideology. So despite the current trends in multiracial dating, the sexual marketplace is still a minefield for people of color. Their choices of intimate partners are defined by a racial hierarchy that places white people at the top. So we know less about intimacy issues among racial and ethnic groups than we should, given that there are more people of color in society than ever before. But there's two reasons that we don't know. One, stereotypes, right, that portray racial and ethnic women and men as more sexual or as less capable of controlling their animal instincts than white people, right? And also the prevailing ideology of love as a white middle-class emotion. So this affects the way that people then understand different kinds of relationships. Alrighty, so claiming control of intimacy. Because intimacy is socially constructed, it offers the possibility for agency, change, and growth. So sexuality has been separated from reproduction. So I put a video here from Democracy Now!, one of my favorite sources ever, that talks about the attacks on reproductive rights that are happening in our country right now, because it's an important context, the social context to what's going to affect, what kind of rights we have, whether or not we have to give birth, whether or not, we're not able to access birth control or those kind of, abortion resources. So, women have a wider range of options than they ever had because of the Roe v. Wade 1973 decision. But right now, this is under attack. There's also some Supreme Court justices that are very conservative, that are looking specifically right now. Precedent cases are being run in order to try and overturn these kind of landmark decisions. So people throughout society are struggling to transform their intimate relationships and, really focus on what matters, enhancing your pleasure, love, connecting, things like that. But this whole idea of sexuality as separate from reproduction, is affected by religious ideologies. So therefore, some people are really motivated to try to control women's sexuality and their control over their own bodies because of their own, institutional understandings of religion. So again, that's why I included this video here. I hope you watch, that kind of looks a little bit at how, Roe v. Wade is, under attack, and that this could ultimately dramatically change the way that relationships work in the future if women are no longer able to make those decisions about their bodies.